Basic concept and recipe. In one of the previous classes, you were introduced to the thermophilic composting. In this class, you will learn in detail of thermophilic composting. Objectives. At the end of this class, you will be able to state the basics of thermophilic composting, describe the advantages of thermophilic composting, list the ingredients of thermophilic composting recipe, identify the items which are to be avoided in thermophilic composting. Now, let's see a few basic concepts regarding thermophilic composting. You can make compost in your backyard that takes less time to make than in the forest by adding ingredients which make the compost that gets hot to about 60 degrees Celsius. This is called thermophilic or hot composting. In this type of composting, all the ingredients are added at once. Now, let's see the advantages of thermophilic composting. We make thermophilic or hot compost because of the following reasons. The heat helps make the compost faster. The heat kills pathogens, bad bacteria. The heat kills weed seeds. Now let's see the ingredients that make up the recipe of thermophilic composting. 4 elements are required for making thermophilic compost. They are carbon, nitrogen, water, and air. Now let's take each element in detail and see what materials are rich in these elements. The first ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is carbon. It consists of all the brown materials. The brown materials constitute 50 to 60% of the total volume. And the browns are of 2 types: yard browns, kitchen browns. Yard browns here refer to dry leaves, straw, shredded paper or cardboard, wood chips or sawdust, coconut husk, and dry grass. The kitchen browns here consist of kitchen scraps like coffee filters, tea bags of paper or cloth, paper napkins, stale bread, chapati, dosa, egg cartons, etc. The second most important ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is nitrogen. It consists of all the green materials. The green materials constitute 40 to 50% of the total volume. The greens are again of 3 types: yard greens, kitchen greens, cow dung and other herbivore manures. Number 1. Yard greens. The yard greens here refer to fresh grass clippings, landscape trimmings, and garden waste. Next are the kitchen greens, which consist of all the kitchen scraps like fruit and vegetable scraps, such as vegetable peels, banana peels, coconut, etc., used coffee ground and used tea leaves, leftover rice and curry. Cow dung and other herbivore manures are also an important source of nitrogen. Adding cow dung acts as a catalyst and speeds up the composting process by adding microbes. The next most important ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is water. The compost pile should have a moisture content of 45%. This should be maintained. It should be moist like a wrung-out sponge. The last most important ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is air. The compost pile needs air to breathe. To create air tunnels in the compost bin with sticks, turn the pile to allow air into the compost. There are a few items which are to be avoided in the thermophilic compost recipe. They are meat, fish, dairy products, feces of dogs and rats. Also, certain non-organic items should be avoided, and these are oil and grease, plastics, metals, chemicals. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned. Thermophilic or hot composting takes less time to make than in the forest. In this type of composting, all the ingredients are added all at once. The heat of the thermophilic compost helps to make the compost faster, kills pathogens and weed seeds. The first ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is carbon, which consists of all the brown materials and constitutes 50 to 60% of the total volume. The browns constitute the yard browns and kitchen browns. The second most important ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is nitrogen, which consists of all the green materials and constitutes 40 to 50% of the total volume. The greens constitute the yard greens and kitchen greens and cow dung. The next most important ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is water. The compost pile should have a moisture content of 45%. And the last most important ingredient of the thermophilic compost recipe is air. The compost pile needs air to breathe. A few items like meat, fish, dairy products, and the feces of dogs and rats, and certain non-organic items like oil and grease, plastics, metals, chemicals should be avoided in the thermophilic compost recipe. You have now learnt the basic concept of thermophilic composting, its advantages, and the ingredients of thermophilic compost recipe. Take our next class to learn the do's and don'ts of making the thermophilic compost pile.